The rain poured relentlessly, transforming the winding road through the Catskill Mountains into a treacherous mirror of water. The rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers added a hypnotic rhythm to the stormy night, but Weston Murray, disguised in a driver's uniform, was far from distracted. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, every muscle in his body tense as he focused on navigating the slippery road. Yet, it wasn't just the storm that weighed on him. It was the hidden purpose of his mission pressing on his chest, like an invisible anchor. In the back seat, Robert and Vivian Whitmore murmured to each other, their voices low but loud enough for Weston to catch every word. The couple exuded arrogance, sitting stiffly as though even the raging storm couldn't diminish their superiority. "It's utterly unbelievable," Robert said, his voice dripping with irritation as he adjusted the scarf around his neck. "Michelle insists on wasting her time with these charity endeavors, as if that's suitable for someone of her stature." "Almost a disgrace," Vivian added with a scoff, raising one perfectly sculpted eyebrow. She swirled the red wine in her crystal goblet, the liquid trembling slightly with the car's bumps. "No, it's completely shameful. She has every opportunity to restore our family's name, and instead, she chooses to mingle with them." The contempt in her voice turned the final word into a sharp dagger. Weston's jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed fixed on the road. He couldn't afford to reveal his emotions. Listening to them was essential. It was the only way to confirm what he'd been suspecting for weeks. "Did you see how enthusiastic she was about that ridiculous event last week?" Vivian continued. "She's talking about opening a community school as if she has any idea how to manage such a thing." "She won't need to once she marries the right man," Robert replied, his tone dismissive. "A man like Weston Murray doesn't appear twice in a woman's life. This marriage is our ticket back to relevance. An expensive ticket, yes, but necessary." Weston's pulse quickened. He had already suspected the Whitmores' financial troubles, but hearing them openly admit that they were treating Michelle like a pawn was infuriating. Michelle wasn't just a tool for their gain. She was strong, compassionate, and independent. She deserved so much more than their schemes. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the road, revealing a sharp bend framed by towering, ominous trees. Weston quickly adjusted the steering wheel, keeping the car steady as rain continued to hammer down. "Drive more carefully," Vivian snapped, her glare meeting his through the rearview mirror. "We wouldn't want to arrive at the party soaked, or worse, dead." "Yes, ma'am," Weston replied neutrally, carefully masking his growing contempt. Each word he spoke had to remain calm and measured. He couldn't afford to slip. "The heating in the house had better be fixed," Robert muttered, ignoring Weston entirely as he turned to Vivian. "We can't have the guests complaining about the cold. This party has to succeed. If we don't prove we're still socially relevant, we'll lose what little respect we have left." "Don't worry," Vivian reassured him, taking a deliberate sip of her wine. "Once this marriage is secured, all of our problems will disappear." Weston's hands tightened on the steering wheel again. Their words only deepened his anger. To them, marriage was nothing more than a transaction, a lifeline to save their crumbling reputation. They didn't care about Michelle's feelings, or the possibility that she might be falling in love with him for who he truly was. A sudden snapping sound broke through his thoughts. Branches whipped across the road, dragged by the howling wind. Weston spotted something dark lying on the asphalt ahead and instinctively slammed on the brakes. The car skidded slightly before regaining its balance, jolting the passengers in the back. "What was that?" Robert shouted, his face pale. "Do you want to kill us, you incompetent fool?" "I'm sorry, sir," Weston replied evenly, his voice betraying none of the fury building within him. Weston kept his voice steady, masking his irritation as he replied, "The road is dangerous in this storm. There was a branch in the way, but I managed to avoid it." "Next time, be more attentive," Vivian snapped, her tone laced with disdain. "We expect flawless service, not a death-defying experience." Weston inhaled deeply, forcing himself to focus on the road once more. Every passing minute in the car tested his patience, but he reminded himself why he was there. He was close to uncovering the truth, and nothing would deter him now. The Whitmore mansion appeared on the horizon, its grand silhouette cutting through the stormy night. The lights glowing from its windows gave it an aura of opulence, but to Weston, it resembled a fortress of deceit rather than a home. Tonight would mark only the beginning. Inside those walls, more secrets would come to light. As he parked the car at the grand entrance, Weston glanced in the rearview mirror. Robert and Vivian were busy fixing their appearances, ensuring they were immaculate for their guests. They had no idea the man in the driver's seat, the one they intended to manipulate, was much more than their humble chauffeur. Switching off the engine, Weston stepped out and hurried to open the door for the Whitmores. As the couple exited the vehicle, sheltered by umbrellas, he promptly handed to them. Weston allowed the rain to wash over his face for a brief moment. It was a fleeting second of relief, a chance to steel himself for the game ahead. The night's battle was only beginning. 6 months earlier, Weston Murray couldn't have imagined himself in this role, disguised as a chauffeur, driving a luxury car, infiltrating the lives of the Whitmore family to uncover the truth. His world had been vastly different then, one built on relentless hard work, achievement, and an unwavering drive for innovation. Weston had grown up in Albany, New York, in a modest suburban home where every dollar was hard-earned and carefully spent. His mother worked grueling shifts as a nurse, while his father, a mechanic, spent long days repairing cars in the garage. From a young age, Weston understood the value of perseverance and determination. It was his father's love for engines that first sparked Weston's curiosity. He spent countless hours dismantling and reassembling old parts, developing a fascination with mechanics that soon grew into a passion for innovation. While other teenagers were out partying, Weston devoted his evenings to designing prototypes and studying engineering. By the age of 20, he had founded his first startup, dedicated to sustainable automotive technologies. Now, at 34, Weston was a self-made billionaire. His name regularly appeared in business magazines, heralded as a visionary. Yet, despite his immense wealth, Weston remained grounded. He continued to drive his own cars and treated his employees as equals, never forgetting his humble beginnings. It was at a rare social event, a charity gala in Manhattan, that Weston's path crossed with Michelle Whitmore's. He had reluctantly attended, persuaded by a close friend who stressed the importance of mingling with influential circles. Weston despised such events, often filled with shallow conversations and hollow smiles. But Michelle was unlike anyone else in the room. She stood apart, quietly admiring a painting with genuine interest, while others paraded around with champagne flutes and rehearsed laughter. Her navy blue dress was understated, a refreshing departure from the extravagant attire Weston had come to expect from the elite. When Weston approached her, he was struck by the sincerity in her voice. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, gesturing to the abstract painting before them. "People think art is all about aesthetics, but I believe it's more about emotion, about what it stirs within you." Weston, accustomed to conversations about profits and strategies, found himself intrigued. "I agree," he replied, "although it seems most people here are more interested in the price tags than the meaning behind the pieces." She laughed, a sound that caught him off guard, like an unexpected melody in a chaotic world. That moment marked the beginning of something Weston never anticipated, setting the stage for the complex, stormy journey that had led him to this very night. "Exactly," Michelle said softly, standing apart from the crowd. "That's why I'm over here. I'm not great at the usual gala small talk." "Neither am I," Weston admitted, offering a warm smile as he extended his hand. "Weston, and you?" "Michelle," she replied, shaking his hand. And just like that, their conversation began. Unlike the superficial chatter Weston was used to, their dialogue flowed effortlessly. Michelle was sharp, passionate, and refreshingly genuine. She didn't fawn over him or try to impress him with connections. She didn't even know who he really was. She spoke instead of her dreams of opening a community school and helping underserved neighborhoods, a passion that seemed to light up her entire demeanor. To her, Weston was simply a kind man she'd met by chance, someone with whom she felt an unexpected connection. Over the months that followed, they saw each other more often. Weston was captivated by Michelle's authenticity and kept his true identity hidden. He didn't want her to see him as Weston Murray, the billionaire tycoon splashed across business magazines. He wanted to be valued for who he truly was. Michelle, for her part, appeared equally drawn to him, and soon, both began envisioning a future together. But there was a problem: her parents. Rumors started to reach Weston through mutual acquaintances. People whispered about how the Whitmores were drowning in financial trouble. Robert Whitmore's reckless investments had led to catastrophic losses, and Vivian's obsession with maintaining appearances had racked up enormous debts. Their sprawling mansion was little more than an empty facade, a hollow symbol of a fortune that had long since evaporated. According to these rumors, the Whitmores saw Michelle as their salvation. They were desperate to ensure she married a man wealthy enough to support their crumbling lifestyle. At first, Weston refused to believe it. Michelle was nothing like her parents. How could someone so pure come from such a manipulative environment? But as the whispers grew louder, Weston realized he had to know the truth. That's when he devised his plan. A family friend conveniently suggested hiring a private chauffeur for the Whitmores, and Weston saw his opportunity. By offering himself for the role, he could observe Michelle's parents up close, see how they treated someone they believed to be beneath them, and ensure Michelle wasn't being used as a pawn in their schemes. The plan was bold and risky. If Michelle ever found out, she could see it as a betrayal of trust, a violation of her privacy. Weston knew he was gambling with their entire relationship, but he also understood that uncovering the truth was the only way to protect her. The night Weston donned the chauffeur's uniform for the first time was a strange mix of anxiety and determination. Adjusting his cap, he climbed into the sleek black sedan he'd personally selected for the job. As he approached the Whitmore mansion, its grand facade loomed like a fortress in the dark. Inside, he knew, every word and gesture from the Whitmores would provide clues to who they really were. His first encounter with Robert and Vivian Whitmore was enough to confirm his worst suspicions. When he pulled up in the polished car, wearing the uniform he'd carefully had tailored, Robert greeted him with a cold, appraising look. "You must be the new chauffeur," Robert said, eyeing Weston as though inspecting a cheap item at a second-hand market. "Be punctual, stay out of sight, and don't ask questions. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Weston replied, lowering his gaze to play the part. Though outwardly calm, he felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. The condescension in Robert's tone reminded him of his early days working as a delivery driver, scraping together every penny to build his company. He hated being underestimated, but in this case, it was exactly what he needed them to believe. Moments later, Vivian appeared at the top of the mansion's grand staircase, descending with deliberate slowness, as if performing for an audience. She was dressed in a bold red gown that seemed entirely too extravagant for the occasion, but Weston suspected that was precisely the point. Her sharp eyes flicked over him with a mix of disinterest and superiority, as though she was evaluating a prop rather than a person. In that instant, Weston realized just how deeply ingrained their arrogance was, and just how much work he had ahead of him. She cast a fleeting glance at Weston, her expression hovering between disdain and indifference, as though addressing a minor inconvenience rather than a person. "I trust you understand," Vivian began, gesturing with theatrical flair, "that we hold our staff to the highest standards. If you prove incompetent, we won't hesitate to replace you. Drivers, after all, are easily replaceable." Weston kept his face neutral, giving a small nod, though his stomach churned with anger. Her words, delivered so casually, reflected an arrogance he'd encountered many times before. People who measured worth solely by status or wealth. But knowing this woman was Michelle's mother made it sting even more. His first assignment as the Whitmores' chauffeur was to drive them to a luncheon with their high society friends. In the back seat, Robert and Vivian talked openly, treating Weston as though he were an inanimate object. While their lack of regard served his purpose of remaining unnoticed, it also tested his patience. "This situation is becoming untenable," Robert muttered irritably, running a hand through his graying hair. "The creditors are calling the mansion directly. Imagine the embarrassment if one of the staff picks up." "We need to be strategic," Vivian replied coolly, her tone calculated. "Michelle is already infatuated with Weston. We just need him to propose. Once that happens, we'll be secure. He has more than enough to support all of us, even with our current circumstances." Weston felt a chill run down his spine. There it was, confirmation of everything he had feared. The Whitmores weren't just overbearing parents. They were using Michelle as a pawn in their financial survival plan. It was clear they didn't view her as a person, but as a means to an end. What struck him most was that Michelle seemed entirely unaware of this. In all their conversations, she'd never hinted at knowing the extent of her family's financial troubles. She was intelligent and perceptive, but the Whitmores were masterful in their deceit, and her trusting nature likely blinded her to their manipulations. After dropping them off at the restaurant, Weston parked the car and sat behind the wheel, lost in thought. Each moment spent in this disguise felt like a test of endurance. The more he learned, the heavier his disappointment grew. Later that afternoon, back at the Whitmore mansion, Weston witnessed another unsettling scene. Vivian, a glass of wine in hand, stood in the garden, berating a maid who had accidentally dropped a tray. "How many times must I tell you to be careful?" she snapped, her face twisted with irritation. "Do you think we work hard to hire people like you just to watch them fail?" The maid, clearly intimidated, lowered her head and apologized. But Weston could see the humiliation in her eyes. He clenched his fists, knowing all too well the feeling of being treated as less than human. He wanted to intervene, but couldn't risk breaking his cover. When Vivian and Robert returned for their next outing, Vivian's complaints shifted to Weston. Sliding into the back seat, she didn't even glance at him as she said, "I hope your driving is better than that maid's tray-carrying skills. We can't have more incompetence today." Weston nodded silently, swallowing his frustration. Each encounter with the Whitmores made their arrogance more apparent. Everything in their world revolved around power, control, and appearances. It was clear they would exploit anyone, even their own daughter, if it served their interests. That evening, as Weston parked the car back at the mansion, he watched the Whitmores stride inside without so much as a word of thanks or acknowledgement. He stayed in the car for a moment, processing everything he had learned. He thought of Michelle, so vibrant and full of compassion. How had she managed to grow up in such an environment and remain so untainted by it? Perhaps it was exactly that contrast, her kindness, her purity, that made her the perfect tool for her parents' schemes. They saw in her what they lacked and intended to use it to secure their own salvation. But Weston wouldn't let them. He knew he needed more information before making his next move. Yet one thing was clear. The Whitmores weren't just manipulative, they were dangerous. And he would do whatever it took to protect Michelle from their schemes. The tension in the car was palpable. Every word exchanged between Robert and Vivian cutting deeper into Weston's resolve. He knew every minute spent under this guise brought him closer to the truth, but also dragged him further into a world of deception and moral conflict. As the storm outside intensified, rattling the sky, Weston drove the Whitmores to a gala dinner. "The state of these roads is disgraceful," Robert grumbled, crossing his arms. "It's absurd that we pay such high taxes only to deal with potholes like this." Vivian rolled her eyes. "Do you really think these drivers care about taxes, Robert? Half of them probably don't even vote. Don't expect them to understand how the system works." Weston tightened his grip on the steering wheel, but kept his face impassive. Their casual dismissal of others grated on him, but he knew he had to endure it. In the back seat, Robert shifted the conversation. Pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket, he opened it to reveal a set of documents. Weston glanced subtly in the rearview mirror, noting the word property printed on one of the pages. He feigned disinterest, but listened intently. "This is all we have left," Robert said, his voice tinged with frustration. "If we can't secure this marriage, we'll lose everything, even the cottage." Weston's heart sank. The stakes were higher than he had imagined, and the Whitmores' desperation was more intense. He would have to tread carefully. Michelle's future depended on it. "It's unbearable to think it's come to this," Robert grumbled, his frustration spilling into his tone. Vivian, however, sounded more resigned. "Then we'll do whatever it takes. Michelle is already captivated by Weston. Have you noticed how she talks about him? It's only a matter of time before he proposes." "And if he doesn't?" Robert snapped, his frown deepening. "What if he finds out about our situation before then?" Vivian let out an exasperated sigh. "He won't. Michelle has no idea we're in this position, and she's certainly not going to tell him what she doesn't know. As long as he believes we're a respectable family, he'll feel compelled to protect her. And, by extension, us." Those words hit Weston like a punch to the gut. What he had overheard before was bad enough, but this confirmed something even more sinister. The Whitmores weren't just manipulating their daughter. They were using her as bait to secure their own survival. Their game was not only reckless, but also dangerously close to shattering Michelle's trust in everyone around her, including Weston himself if she ever discovered his undercover plan. Later that evening, as Weston waited outside the gala, he overheard a snippet of conversation between Robert and another guest. Positioned strategically near the entrance with his car window slightly open, Weston picked up fragments of their discussion. "So, do you really think this wedding is going to happen?" the man asked, his tone laced with skepticism and amusement. "I don't just think it, I'm certain of it," Robert replied confidently. "Weston is intelligent, yes, but he's also a man of principle, and men like that are easy to manipulate. They believe they can save the world, especially the people they love. Michelle will be our bridge to security. He'll never stop taking care of her, and by doing that, he'll be taking care of us too." The other man chuckled. "It's a bold strategy, I'll give you that. But given your situation, it seems you don't have much to lose." Weston's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. He wasn't sure what enraged him more, Robert's brazen cynicism or the fact that someone else was casually validating such a manipulative plan. The thought of being treated like a pawn in a game he hadn't even realized he was playing made his stomach churn. But Weston knew he couldn't react. Not yet. That night, as he drove the Whitmores back to the mansion, his mind raced with doubts and questions. He loved Michelle. Of that, he was absolutely certain. But what would happen when she learned the truth? How would she handle the revelation that her own parents were exploiting her for their financial survival? And even more daunting, how would she react to finding out that Weston had been working undercover to expose it all? The tension in the car was suffocating, though ironically, Robert and Vivian remained blissfully unaware of Weston's inner turmoil. Vivian reclined in the back seat, clearly drained after an evening of forced pleasantries and shallow conversations. Robert, on the other hand, stared at his phone, his expression darkening with every message he read. "These investors are becoming unbearable," Robert muttered, his voice a mix of irritation and concern. "If only Weston would be more public about his future plans, we could leverage that to our advantage." "Patience, darling," Vivian replied with a tired sigh. "He's still at the early stages with Michelle. Give it time. Soon." Her voice trailed off, but Weston didn't need her to finish. He knew exactly what they were counting on. They wanted Michelle and Weston's relationship to progress quickly enough to solidify their own security before the truth could come to light. As he navigated the car through the dimly lit streets, Weston couldn't help but feel the weight of his decisions. Every passing moment brought him closer to uncovering the full extent of the Whitmore's scheme, but it also brought him closer to the point of no return. He resolved that, no matter the cost, he would protect Michelle. She deserved the truth, even if it meant risking their relationship to give it to her. "Everything will become clear," Vivian said with an air of confidence. "We'll get what we need." Back at the mansion, Weston dutifully helped Vivian out of the car, while Robert muttered something about needing a strong drink before heading to bed. Once they were gone, Weston sat alone in the car and finally allowed himself a deep breath. Every day, the situation grew more tangled, and he knew an inevitable confrontation was looming. The only question was when and how it would happen. As the mansion's lights dimmed, Weston stared at the imposing structure, making a silent vow. No matter what it took, he would protect Michelle. But to do that, he needed to remain patient and careful. The Whitmores were masters at their game, but Weston held a card they didn't: integrity. And he was ready to wield it as his weapon to turn the tables. The next morning, the mansion stood shrouded in an unsettling silence. Though sunlight streamed through the towering windows, the tension in the air was palpable. Weston knew that this day would be critical. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him, but hesitation was no longer an option. He could sense it in Vivian's fleeting glances and Robert's increasing agitation. They were preparing to make their move. Weston arrived early, as always, but this time with a plan. Whispered conversations in the back seat were no longer enough. He needed irrefutable evidence of their true intentions. From his vantage point in the driveway, Weston observed the household's morning routine. Vivian, ever the perfectionist, barked orders at the staff, while Robert remained holed up in his study. Weston had noticed Robert bringing in a stack of confidential papers the night before, and he knew this could be his chance. The opportunity came when Robert stepped out into the garden to take a call, leaving his study door unlocked. Heart pounding, Weston slipped inside. He rifled through the desk drawers and found exactly what he was looking for: unfinished contracts, mounting debt records, and threatening letters from creditors. One document stood out: a letter from a creditor warning that the mansion would be seized within weeks if payments weren't made. But what truly made Weston's stomach churn was a folder labeled with Michelle's name. Inside were unsent letters, written by Robert, all addressed to Weston. The tone was one of calculated desperation. "You love my daughter," one letter read. "And as her father, all I want is to ensure she has a safe and secure life. But to make that happen, we need your help." The words made Weston's blood boil. Robert wasn't just manipulating Michelle, he was using her as an emotional bargaining chip, all under the guise of paternal concern. This, Weston realized, was the final straw. Later that day, Weston drove the Whitmores to a luncheon with potential investors. Vivian, adorned with an extravagant necklace he suspected was purchased on credit, chattered excitedly about the family's bright future. "With these new investments," she said, flashing a smile at Robert, "we'll finally have the resources to restore the country estate." Robert responded with a faint smile, but Weston could see the unease in his eyes. They were teetering on the edge of a financial cliff, and they both knew it. "Joe," Vivian said abruptly, using the alias Weston had given them, "be sure to drive carefully when you pick us up later. We need to look impeccable for the gala dinner. Michelle shouldn't have anything to be embarrassed about." Weston felt a surge of anger, but kept his expression calm. "Yes, ma'am," he replied evenly, knowing that every moment brought him closer to the breaking point. That breaking point came later that afternoon, during the drive back to the mansion. Rain began to fall, the rhythmic drumming on the car roof mirroring the tension inside. Unable to contain his anxiety, Robert broke the silence. "We need Weston to propose as soon as possible," he said bluntly. "Michelle is already invested, but time isn't on our side. If he finds out about the debts before then, we're finished." Vivian sighed, her irritation seeping through her voice. "Yes, but we need to be subtle. We can't afford to look desperate." Weston couldn't take it anymore. The adrenaline surged through him as he gripped the steering wheel tightly. Glancing in the rearview mirror, he locked eyes with Robert. "Interesting to hear, Mr. Whitmore," he said calmly, but his voice carried an unmistakable edge. The car fell silent. Vivian and Robert exchanged panicked glances, their composure beginning to crack. "What do you mean by that?" Robert asked, his voice louder than usual in an attempt to mask his unease. Weston pulled the car into the driveway and turned off the engine. Slowly, deliberately, he removed the driver's cap that had been part of his disguise. Turning to face them, his gaze was steady and unyielding. "I mean," Weston said, his voice sharp and unwavering, "maybe you should know who's really driving this car." Vivian's face turned ashen, and Robert seemed frozen in place, unable to process what was happening. "I'm Weston Murray," he continued, his tone like steel. "And yes, I've been here to uncover the truth, because unlike you, I don't make decisions blindly, and now I know exactly what kind of people you are." The tension in the car erupted like a lightning strike. Vivian, visibly shaken, tried to regain her composure, but her words faltered. We were only trying to protect our family." "Protect?" Weston interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. "You weren't protecting anyone. You were using your own daughter as a pawn in your schemes. That's not protection. It's selfishness, and it's unforgivable." Robert opened his mouth to respond, but Weston raised a hand to silence him. "I don't want to hear it. You exploited Michelle's kindness and trust, and the worst part? She has no idea what you've been doing." The rain outside intensified, thunder rumbling ominously in the distance as if echoing the confrontation. Vivian, unable to maintain her mask of composure, broke into tears. "Please," she begged, her voice trembling. "Don't tell her. Michelle wouldn't understand. She'd never forgive us." Weston sat silently for a moment, his anger boiling beneath the surface. Finally, he said, "Michelle deserves the truth, and she'll hear it, but not from you." Without another word, he stepped out of the car, slamming the door behind him. He walked into the mansion, leaving Vivian and Robert sitting in the rain with the chaos they had created. The rain poured down in sheets, veiling the Whitmore mansion in a cold, relentless curtain. Inside its opulent walls, however, a storm far more volatile was about to erupt. Weston entered the grand hall with purposeful strides, his wet shoes leaving faint marks on the pristine marble floor. His expression was grim, his resolve unshakable. There was no turning back now. Michelle sat in an armchair near the fireplace, a book resting in her lap. The flickering warmth of the fire illuminated her serene face, a stark contrast to the chill Weston felt in his chest. She looked up and smiled when she saw him, but her smile quickly faded as she noticed the seriousness in his demeanor. "Weston," she said, rising from her chair, concern etched into her features. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" Before Weston could respond, the front door burst open. Vivian and Robert entered, their nerves visibly frayed. Vivian attempted a weak smile, but it fell flat. Robert, on the other hand, looked like he was on the verge of losing control, though he clung to a thin veneer of calm. "Michelle," Vivian began, her voice shaky as she ignored Weston entirely. "Darling, we need to talk to you about something important." Michelle's brow furrowed in confusion. "What's going on?" Before Vivian could continue, Weston stepped forward and raised a hand. His voice was firm, filled with emotion. "They won't tell you. I will." Michelle's gaze darted between Weston and her parents, her confusion growing. "What's happening? Can someone please explain?" Weston took a deep breath, his chest tight with the weight of the truth. "Michelle, there's something you need to know about your parents and about me." He hesitated, his voice faltering for a moment before he continued. "I'm not who you think I am. I'm not just Weston Murray, the man you've been dating. For the past few weeks, I've been working undercover, posing as your family's chauffeur to uncover what's really going on here." Michelle's eyes widened, disbelief clouding her face. You What? You disguised yourself? Why would you do that? Before Weston could explain, Robert interjected, his voice booming. He did it because he doesn't trust us. He's trying to make us look like villains when all we've done is protect you. Weston turned to Robert, his anger finally spilling over. Protect? Don't you dare call it that. You've been manipulating her, lying to her, and using her as a tool to save your own skin. That's not protection. That's betrayal. Michelle raised her hands, her voice trembling as she tried to make sense of the chaos. Enough. Can someone please tell me what's really going on? Weston turned back to her, meeting her gaze. His voice softened, but his words carried a heavy weight. Michelle, your parents are in serious debt. They're about to lose everything, and they've been counting on our relationship to fix it. They were planning to use me, through you, as their way out. The silence that followed was deafening. Michelle turned to her parents, her expression shifting from confusion to pain. Is it true? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vivian broke down, tears streaming down her face. Robert stared at the floor, unable to meet his daughter's eyes. Michelle, Vivian sobbed, we just wanted what was best for you, and for our family. Best for me? Michelle repeated, incredulous. You lied to me. You used me. How can that possibly be what's best for me? Weston stepped forward, desperation in his voice. Michelle, I know this is overwhelming, but I told you the truth because I care about you. I wanted to protect you from this, from them. Michelle turned to him, tears spilling down her cheeks. Protect me? You lied to me too, Weston. You infiltrated my life, pretending to be someone you're not. How is that any different from what they did? Weston felt the sting of her words and tried to respond, but no sound came out. Before he could gather his thoughts, Robert stepped forward, pleading. Michelle, please, you have to understand. We did this out of desperation. We didn't have another choice. You always have a choice, Michelle shot back, her voice shaking with anger. And you chose to lie. You chose to use me. Vivian collapsed to her knees, clutching at the hem of Michelle's dress. We're your family, Michelle. Please, don't abandon us. We need you. Michelle took a step back, her expression hardening. Family? A family that lies, manipulates, and uses its own members to survive isn't a family. It's selfishness. Weston found his voice again, his tone earnest. Michelle, I know what I did was wrong. I know I hurt you, but I did it to protect you. I love you, and I couldn't stand by while they took advantage of you. She looked at him, pain and disappointment mingling in her eyes. I need time, Weston. I don't know who to trust right now. Everything feels like a lie. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Michelle glanced one last time at her parents, who stood frozen in despair, then at Weston, whose face was etched with regret. Without another word, she turned and walked up the stairs, leaving them all behind. Weston stood motionless, the weight of everything that had unfolded pressing heavily on him. The weight of Weston's actions pressed heavily on him as he sat in silence. He knew he loved Michelle more than anything, but he couldn't shake the fear that it might already be too late to make amends. The sun was setting over the Whitmore mansion, casting the sky in hues of orange and gold. Upstairs, Michelle sat in her bedroom, gazing out the window at the garden where she had spent so much of her childhood. That space, once a sanctuary, now seemed filled with bittersweet memories. Everything she thought she knew about her family, her relationship with Weston, and even herself had been upended by the revelations of the past few days. With a heavy sigh, she picked up her phone. Though hesitant, she knew this conversation couldn't be avoided forever. Weston deserved an answer, and perhaps a chance to explain. Weston sat on the balcony of his home, staring out at the horizon as the sun dipped below it. The sound of an approaching car pulled him from his thoughts, and his heart raced when he saw Michelle step out of the vehicle. A mix of hope and Anxiety swelled within him as she walked toward him, her eyes bright, yet her expression somber. "Michelle," he said softly, searching her face for a sign of how she felt. She offered a faint smile. "Hi, Weston. Can I come in?" "Of course," he replied, moving quickly to open the door. "Always." They sat in the living room, the silence stretching between them like an unspoken question. Weston, unable to hold back his emotions, was the first to speak. "Michelle," he began, his voice unsteady, "I'm so sorry for everything. I know what I did was wrong, and I'll never forgive myself for lying to you, even if I thought I was doing it for the right reasons. I love you, and all I've ever wanted is your happiness, even if it means letting you go." Michelle's eyes glistened with tears as she listened, her expression softening in a way Weston hadn't dared hope for. When she spoke, her voice was steady, though laced with pain. "Weston, you lied to me. You hid the truth and inserted yourself into my life without my knowledge. It hurt. It still hurts." Weston lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. "But," she continued, her tone softening, "you also showed me something no one else had the courage to. You opened my eyes to the truth about my family, and you did it because you care about me. Even though what you did was wrong, you did it out of love, and that means something to me." Weston looked up, surprise and cautious hope lighting his face. "Do you really think we can move past this?" Michelle smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "I believe that if we're honest with each other from now on and work together, we can overcome anything." Relief flooded Weston's features, and a small, grateful smile crossed his lips. "I promise, Michelle, no more lies, ever. I want to build something real with you, something lasting." She reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Me too." In the months that followed, Robert and Vivian Whitmore began to rebuild their lives. They sold off unnecessary possessions and, for the first time in decades, learned to live modestly. While their relationship with Michelle remained strained, she set firm boundaries, which they finally began to respect. Surprisingly, Weston extended a hand to help them with their debts, on one condition: complete transparency about how the funds would be used. Though Robert's pride made it difficult, he ultimately accepted, grateful for the opportunity to start fresh. A year later, Weston took Michelle on a trip to the town where he'd grown up. He wanted her to see the place that had shaped him, a place rooted in simplicity and meaning. As the sun set, they strolled through a quiet park, the golden light bathing the trees. Weston stopped, gently taking her hands. "Michelle," he began, his voice filled with emotion, "this past year has proven to me that we can get through anything together. You are the most incredible woman I've ever met, and I don't want to spend another day of my life without you." He knelt down, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Opening it, he revealed a sparkling ring that caught the fading sunlight. "Michelle Whitmore," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "Will you marry me?" Michelle laughed, tears spilling from her eyes as she nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, Weston. Yes. 1,000 times, yes." Weston slipped the ring onto her finger before standing and pulling her into his arms. As they kissed, the sound of children playing and the gentle rustling of leaves created a perfect melody for the moment. A few months later, Weston and Michelle were married in an intimate ceremony surrounded by their closest friends and family. As Michelle walked down the aisle, her arm linked with Robert's, his expression was one of rare, genuine emotion. Vivian, too, looked more humble, her gratitude for her daughter's presence unmistakable. Under the stars that evening, Weston and Michelle shared their first dance as husband and wife. In that moment, they knew that their journey, though filled with trials and challenges, had led them to a love that was stronger, more honest, and unbreakable. Together, they were ready to face whatever the future might hold. The road ahead wouldn't be without challenges, but they were ready to navigate it together, with love and honesty as the foundation of their journey. This was the start of a new chapter for Weston and Michelle. Not as flawless heroes, but as two people who had faced their struggles, learned from them, and found strength in one another. Together, they were determined to grow, no matter what life threw their way. Thank you for sharing this moment with us. Every story I tell is crafted with care and dedication, with the hope of touching the hearts of those who hear it. If this story resonated with you, please consider joining us on this journey of storytelling. Your support makes it possible for us to continue creating narratives that inspire, move, and connect. Cheers to the moments we share, and I'll see you in the next story.